Before we begin this emotional journey, if you're enjoying stories that touch the heart and explore the complexities of family relationships, consider subscribing to this channel for more powerful narratives that will stay with you long after they end. Now, let's dive into Margaret's story. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Margaret Lawson's kitchen, casting delicate patterns across the wooden table where she sat, fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of Earl Grey tea. At 67, Margaret carried her years with grace, silver hair swept into a neat bun, fine lines mapping a life well lived across her face, and eyes that still sparkled with intelligence and warmth. The steam from her tea rose in lazy spirals as she gazed out at her meticulously tended garden, planning which bulbs to plant for the spring. The sudden ring of her doorbell pulled her from her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. Setting down her mug, she made her way through the hall, smoothing her cardigan as she went. "Daniel," she said, surprise evident in her voice as she opened the door to find her only son standing on her porch. Tall and broad-shouldered, with his father's square jaw, he was dressed in a crisp business suit that seemed at odds with this unexpected morning visit. "Is everything all right? Is Jacob okay?" Her thoughts immediately flew to her 8-year-old grandson. "Everything's fine, Mom," Daniel replied, leaning in to kiss her cheek before stepping past her into the house. There was something brisk, almost businesslike in his manner that made Margaret's brow furrow slightly. "Jacob's at school. I just thought we should talk." Margaret followed him into the living room, where framed photographs chronicled their family history: Daniel's graduation, his wedding to Christine, Jacob's birth, holidays, and birthdays. A life documented in smiles and embraces. "Tea?" she offered, but Daniel shook his head, remaining standing as Margaret settled into her favorite armchair. "I'll get straight to the point, Mom," he said, his hands clasped behind his back as he paced the room. "I've been thinking about the future, my future, Jacob's future." Margaret nodded encouragingly, though something in her chest tightened at his tone. "That's always wise. I need capital for an investment opportunity," he continued, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "It's significant, but the returns would be life-changing for all of us." "I see," Margaret said carefully. "And you're coming to me for a loan?" Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. "Not exactly. I'm talking about your assets, Mom. The house, your savings, Dad's life insurance, all of it." The room seemed to grow suddenly quiet, as if the world itself had paused in disbelief. Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken, the steady rhythm that had carried her through 67 years of life suddenly faltering. "My inheritance," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You want your inheritance. Now." "It's not like that," Daniel protested, though his eyes shifted away again. "Think of it as accelerating the inevitable. You're comfortable, Mom. You've worked hard your whole life. Now you can relax while I grow what you and Dad built. It makes financial sense." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she placed it on the arm of her chair. "Daniel, everything I have is earmarked for you and Jacob eventually, you know that. But I'm still very much alive, and I have plans for my retirement. Travel, perhaps, charity work, and I need security." "Security?" Daniel's laugh held an edge she'd never heard before. "Mom, you'd be living with us. You wouldn't need to worry about expenses." The image flashed through Margaret's mind. Her belongings packed away, her independence surrendered, living as a guest in her son's home. A life where every cup of tea would feel like someone else's charity. "No," she said, her voice finding its strength again. "I'm sorry, Daniel, but no. This is my life, my home, what I've built with your father. I'm not ready to give it up." She expected disappointment, perhaps anger. What she didn't expect was the cold calculation that settled over Daniel's features. "I was afraid you might say that," he said quietly. "I'd hoped you would be reasonable." "Reasonable," Margaret echoed, genuine confusion in her voice. "Daniel, what's going on? This isn't like you." "Maybe you just don't know me as well as you think," he replied, reaching for his coat. Or maybe you're not seeing things clearly anymore. It happens at your age. And the implication hung in the air between them, poisonous and unthinkable. Before Margaret could respond, Daniel had moved to the door. "Think about it, Mom," he said, his hand on the doorknob, "for all our sakes." The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed through Margaret's suddenly too empty house. She sat motionless in her chair, the morning sun continuing to stream through the windows, oblivious to how the world had just tilted on its axis. The first indication that something was wrong came 3 days later at St. Mark's Church bake sale. Margaret had been arranging her legendary apple pies on the display table when she noticed Elaine Henderson and Betty Walker, friends of 20 years, huddled together across the room, casting furtive glances in her direction. "Margaret," Elaine said, approaching with a hesitant smile when she realized she'd been spotted. "How are you feeling today, dear?" The question seemed oddly weighted. "I'm fine, Elaine," Margaret replied, straightening the small handwritten price cards. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," Elaine said quickly, exchanging a look with Betty. "It's just, Daniel mentioned you hadn't been quite yourself lately. Memory issues, he said. We're all concerned." Margaret's hands stilled on the table. "Memory issues. It's nothing to be ashamed of," Betty added, her voice dropping to a whisper, though no one else was nearby. "These things happen as we age. Daniel's being very brave about it all." "I assure you both," Margaret said carefully, fighting to keep her voice even, "my memory is perfectly intact." The women exchanged another glance, this one tinged with pity. "Of course, dear," Elaine said, patting Margaret's hand. "Of course it is." They drifted away, heads bent together in continued conversation, leaving Margaret standing alone among her pies, a cold realization spreading through her chest. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern repeated itself with alarming consistency. Her neighbor, Robert, stopped asking for gardening advice. The pharmacist spoke to her in deliberately slow, loud tones. Her sister-in-law called from Arizona, awkwardly inquiring about her condition. Each interaction was a pebble in an avalanche of doubt, each concerned look another nail in the coffin of her reputation. Daniel, meanwhile, had been conspicuously absent, returning her calls with brief, distracted conversations. "Just checking in, Mum," he would say, his voice artificially bright. "Making sure you're remembering to eat properly, taking your medications." "What medications, Daniel?" she asked during one such call, her patience finally wearing thin. "I'm not on any medications, as you well know." Right, he said smoothly. "My mistake. Listen, I was thinking we should have dinner next week. Just the two of us, to clear the air." Margaret stood in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, staring at the calendar on her wall where she'd meticulously noted every appointment, birthday, and obligation. Her eyes fell on a photograph of Daniel as a boy, gap-toothed and beaming, holding up a fish he'd caught on a trip with his father. "That would be nice," she said softly, though every instinct warned her against it. "Great," Daniel replied, relief evident in his voice. "Friday at 7. My place. I'll cook." After hanging up, Margaret moved through her empty house with deliberate steps, touching familiar objects as if to anchor herself to reality. In her study, she unlocked the bottom drawer of her desk and removed a leather-bound journal. Opening to a fresh page, she began to write, documenting every conversation, every strange look, every piece of evidence of what Daniel was attempting to do. When she finished writing, she reached for her phone and scrolled to a number she hadn't called in years. "Hartman Investigations," a gruff voice answered. "Mr. Hartman," Margaret said, her voice steady now that she had made her decision. "This is Margaret Lawson. You helped me with a matter 15 years ago when I was principal at Westridge Elementary." "Mrs. Lawson," he replied, recognition warming his tone. "Of course I remember. What can I do for you?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I find myself in need of your services again. It's a delicate family matter." By the time she hung up, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across her living room. Margaret watched them stretch and distort, thinking how quickly the familiar could become strange and threatening. She hadn't wanted to believe her own son capable of such betrayal, but she couldn't ignore the evidence mounting around her. As darkness fell, she made one more call to her old friend and attorney, James Sullivan. "I need to make some changes to my will," she told him, "and I need your advice on something else, something urgent." That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman who stared back at her was changed, not by dementia or confusion as Daniel would have everyone believe, but by the sharp clarity that comes with betrayal. Her eyes were clear and focused, her jaw set with determination. "So be it," she whispered to her reflection. "If this is the game he wants to play, then I will play it too." Friday evening arrived with an unseasonable chill. Margaret dressed carefully in a navy blue dress she knew looked elegant on her, applied a touch of lipstick, and clasped her mother's pearl necklace around her throat. From her closet, she retrieved a small handbag, checking its contents methodically before snapping it shut. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Car parked 2 houses down, in position. H." She deleted the message and took one last look around her bedroom, a space filled with memories of a life well lived. For a moment, grief threatened to overwhelm her, not for herself, but for what her son had become. Where had she gone wrong? What hunger for more had twisted him into someone who could treat his own mother this way? The drive to Daniel's suburban home took 20 minutes. Each mile increased the heaviness in Margaret's chest, but also strengthened her resolve. The house was lit up as she pulled into the driveway, a beautiful Tudor-style home that Daniel and Christine had purchased 3 years ago with help from a generous down payment Margaret had provided. Christine opened the door, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Margaret," she said, leaning in for a brief hug, "it's good to see you." "Where's Jacob?" Margaret asked, looking past her daughter-in-law into the house. "Sleep over at a friend's," Christine replied, taking Margaret's coat. Daniel thought it would be nice for the adults to talk without interruption. Of course he did, Margaret thought, but she merely nodded and followed Christine into the dining room. The table was elaborately set for 3, with Daniel's best wine glasses and the china Margaret had given them as a wedding present. Daniel emerged from the kitchen, an apron tied around his waist and a wooden spoon in hand. For a brief, disorienting moment, he looked exactly like the boy who had once helped her bake cookies on Sunday afternoons. "Mom," he said warmly, crossing to kiss her cheek, "you look lovely. I'm making your favorite, coq au vin." The normalcy of it all was jarring. Margaret accepted a glass of wine from Christine and took a seat at the table, watching as her son and daughter-in-law moved around each other with practiced ease, serving the meal, refilling glasses, maintaining a steady stream of light conversation. "Jacob's doing so well in school," Christine was saying. "His teacher thinks he might be gifted in mathematics." "That doesn't surprise me," Margaret replied, smiling genuinely for the first time that evening. His grandfather was the same way. Daniel's expression softened at the mention of his father. "Dad would have been proud," he agreed, raising his glass in a small toast. For a moment, Margaret allowed herself to hope that perhaps she had misunderstood, that this dinner truly was an olive branch extended across troubled waters. But as the main course was cleared away and coffee was served, she noticed Daniel checking his watch with increasing frequency. "Is someone joining us?" she asked, setting down her coffee cup. The doorbell rang before Daniel could answer. He and Christine exchanged a glance that confirmed Margaret's suspicions. "Actually, yes," Daniel said, rising from the table. "I hope you don't mind, but I thought it might be helpful to have some professional input on our discussion." He returned moments later, accompanied by 3 men in business suits, each carrying leather portfolios. Margaret recognized one immediately, Harold Winters, a partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms. "Mrs. Lawson," Winters said, extending his hand. "A pleasure to meet you. I'm Daniel's attorney." "And these gentlemen?" Margaret asked, her voice remarkably steady as she gestured to the other 2 men. "Dr. Phillips is a geriatric specialist," Daniel explained, "and Mr. Beck is a financial advisor. I thought it would be good to have all perspectives represented." "I see," Margaret said, folding her hands in her lap. "And what exactly are we discussing that requires such an array of expertise?" Daniel took a seat directly across from her, leaning forward with an expression of practiced concern. "Mom, we're worried about you, living alone at your age, managing your finances, making complex decisions. It's a lot. We think it would be best if you allowed us to help." "Help?" Margaret repeated, the word hollow. "We've prepared a power of attorney," Winters interjected, sliding a document across the table. "It would give Daniel authority to manage your affairs for your own protection." "And what do you think, Dr. Phillips?" Margaret asked, turning to the silver-haired physician who had yet to speak. "Do you believe I need protection from myself?" The doctor cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, Mrs. Lawson, I haven't had the opportunity to examine you personally, but based on what Daniel has described, episodes of confusion, memory lapses, difficulty managing daily tasks, these are concerning symptoms that warrant investigation." "Symptoms Daniel has described," Margaret clarified, her gaze returning to her son. "I see. Mom," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a gentle, patronizing tone that made Margaret's skin crawl. "You don't always realize when you're forgetting things. That's part of the condition." "And if I refuse to sign this document?" Margaret asked, not touching the papers before her. Daniel's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Then we'd have to consider more formal measures, a competency hearing perhaps, but I'd rather not put you through that." "It would mean court appearances," Christine added, "public records. People would talk." The threat was clear: sign voluntarily or be declared incompetent by force. "And Jacob?" Margaret asked quietly. "What does this mean for my relationship with him?" Daniel's eyes met hers directly. "That depends on how this goes, Mom. Cooperate and nothing changes. Make this difficult." He let the sentence hang unfinished. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Margaret looked around the table at the faces watching her, Daniel's determination, Christine's discomfort, the professional detachment of the three strangers brought in to formalize her removal from her own life. "I see," she said again, reaching for her handbag. "You've thought of everything." "It's for the best, Mom," Daniel insisted. "You'll be taken care of. You can live here with us. No more worries." Margaret opened her bag and removed not a pen, but her phone. "Before I make any decisions," she said calmly, "there's someone I'd like to consult." She dialed a number and put the phone to her ear. "Yes," she said after a moment. "We're ready now." Daniel's expression shifted from confidence to confusion. "Mom, who are you calling?" Margaret set the phone down on the table. "You arranged for your experts to be here, Daniel. I thought it only fair that I bring my own." The doorbell rang again. Christine, looking increasingly uncomfortable, rose to answer the door. The dining room remained silent, tension building like a summer storm. When she returned, she was accompanied by a tall, stern-looking woman in a tailored suit and a man whose weathered face suggested years of seeing the darker side of human nature. "Gentlemen," Margaret said, her voice steady, "I'd like to introduce Olivia Ramirez, my attorney, and Michael Hartman, a private investigator I've engaged." Daniel's face drained of color. "What is this?" "This," Ms. Ramirez replied, placing her own briefcase on the table, "is what we call a counter-offensive, Mr. Lawson." Mr. Hartman remained standing, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on Daniel with the patient intensity of a man accustomed to watching people unravel. "For the past 3 weeks," Margaret explained, her hands folded calmly before her, "Mr. Hartman has been documenting your activities, Daniel, the conversations you've had with my friends and neighbors, the appointment you tried to make with Dr. Phillips here, without my knowledge or consent, to discuss my condition, the calls to my bank inquiring about my accounts." Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. You're proving my point, Mom. paranoid delusions, hiring private investigators. Actually, Mr. Hartman interrupted, speaking for the first time, what your mother has done is exercise prudent self-protection in the face of what appears to be a coordinated campaign to undermine her autonomy and access her assets. Ms. Ramirez opened her briefcase and removed a folder. We have affidavits from Mrs. Lawson's personal physician confirming her excellent cognitive health. We have documentation of her financial management, which demonstrates not only competence, but considerable acumen. And we have this. She slid a small digital recorder across the table. What's that? Daniel demanded, not reaching for it. Play it, Margaret said softly. Ms. Ramirez pressed a button, and Daniel's voice filled the room. Look, I just need you to say you've noticed some concerning behaviors. You don't have to commit to a diagnosis. I just need enough to raise doubts about her competence. There's a lot at stake here. The voice that responded was Dr. Phillips. I understand, but without examining her personally, there are ethical considerations. I'm talking about a hypothetical assessment based on reported symptoms, Daniel cut in. And I'm willing to compensate you for your professional opinion. Ms. Ramirez stopped the recording. Dr. Phillips looked stricken, his professional demeanor crumbling under the weight of the revealed conversation. That's out of context, Daniel stammered, looking to Mr. Winters for support. The attorney, however, was already gathering his papers, a deep frown etched into his features. I think I should excuse myself from these proceedings, he said stiffly. Mr. Lawson will need to speak privately about this development. Dr. Phillips stood as well. I had no idea the extent of... I should go. Please do, Margaret said, her voice tinged with disappointment rather than anger. Though I would appreciate it, Doctor, if you would refrain from discussing my health with anyone other than me in the future. As the two men made hasty exits, Mr. Beck, the financial advisor, remained frozen in his seat, looking as though he wished he could disappear. You may go too, Mr. Beck, Margaret said kindly. I suspect your services won't be required tonight after all. When the door closed behind them, only Daniel, Christine, Margaret, and her two advocates remained in the dining room. The elaborate dinner setting now seemed like a stage prop in a particularly dark play. How could you do this? Daniel finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Record private conversations? Hire investigators to spy on your own son? How could you try to declare your own mother incompetent for financial gain? Margaret countered, her composure finally beginning to crack. How could you poison my relationships, threaten to keep me from my grandson, attempt to strip me of everything I've worked for? Christine, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly pushed back from the table. I can't do this, she said, her voice shaking. I told you this was wrong, Daniel. I told you. She turned to Margaret, tears in her eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't know how far he was planning to go. He said it was just about protecting you, about securing Jacob's future. I should have said something sooner. Daniel rounded on his wife. Don't you dare turn on me now. You were fine with this when we discussed what we could do with the money, the vacation home, Jacob's private school, your studio renovation. Not like this, Christine insisted. Never like this. Margaret watched the disintegration of her son's marriage playing out before her with a profound sadness. This wasn't what she had wanted, to drive another wedge between them. She had only wanted to protect herself. What happens now? Daniel asked, turning back to Margaret, his earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. Ms. Ramirez answered instead. That depends on your mother. She has grounds for legal action. Attempted financial elder abuse is a serious offense. But she hasn't decided whether to pursue that course. All eyes turned to Margaret. In that moment, looking at her son, the boy she had raised, the man he had become, the chasm that now existed between them, she felt the full weight of her years pressed down upon her. I don't want legal proceedings, she said finally. I don't want to see my son prosecuted or my grandson's father disgraced publicly. What I want is acknowledgement of what you've done, Daniel. And I want your word that it ends here. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, a complex mix of emotions playing across his face: shame, relief, confusion, and something deeper that Margaret couldn't quite identify. "I don't understand," he said at last. "After what I tried to do to you, you're letting me walk away?" "I'm your mother," Margaret replied simply. "That hasn't changed, even if everything else has." The following weeks passed in a haze of quiet reconstruction. Margaret moved through her days with mechanical precision, tending her garden, attending church, shopping for groceries, all the routines of a life that no longer felt quite her own. The neighborhood whispers faded after Ms. Ramirez visited key community members to clarify misunderstandings about Margaret's health. Friends cautiously resumed normal interactions, though something had been irreparably altered. Once trust is questioned, it can never be fully restored to its original unself-conscious state. Daniel had not contacted her since that night. Christine called once, her voice tight with unspoken emotion, to say that they were working through things and that Jacob missed his grandmother. Margaret arranged to take the boy for ice cream the following Saturday, a small step toward normalcy that left her both grateful and aching. On a crisp autumn morning 3 weeks after the confrontation, Margaret sat in James Sullivan's office, reviewing the changes to her will and estate plan. "Everything's in order," the attorney assured her, passing her the final document for signature. "The trust for Jacob is secure and can only be accessed for his education and well-being. Daniel has no direct control over it." "And the house?" Margaret asked, pen poised above the paper. "As discussed, it will be sold upon your passing, with proceeds divided between Jacob's Trust and the Women's Shelter Foundation." Margaret nodded and signed her name with a steady hand. "Thank you, James, for everything." "Are you sure about this, Margaret?" he asked, not for the first time. "Cutting Daniel out almost entirely?" "He'll receive a small inheritance," she replied, "enough to respect his father's wishes that he be included. But I can't risk leaving him in control of Jacob's future security, not after what's happened." As she left the attorney's office, Margaret felt a strange lightness. The decisions had been made, the papers signed. Her life, what remained of it, was once again her own to direct. That evening, as she prepared a simple dinner for herself, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw Daniel standing on her porch, hands thrust deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the autumn chill. For a moment, she considered not answering, protecting herself from whatever new pain this visit might bring. But she opened the door. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice rough. He looked terrible, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes and a pallor that spoke of sleepless nights. "Daniel," she replied, neither inviting him in nor sending him away. "I've been seeing someone," he blurted out, "a therapist, twice a week since that night." Margaret said nothing, waiting. "She's helping me understand," he continued, struggling visibly with the words, "why I did what I did. It's not an excuse. There is no excuse. But I needed to know why I could even think of hurting you that way." The evening air was growing colder. Margaret stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I was just making tea." They sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had taught him to bake cookies, where she had bandaged his skinned knees, where they had grieved together after his father's passing. The space between them now seemed vast and untraversable. "Christine moved out," Daniel said, staring into his untouched tea. "She's taken Jacob to stay with her sister while we figure things out." "I'm sorry to hear that," Margaret replied, and meant it. "Don't be. She was right to go. I've been—" He paused, searching for the word. "Toxic. Obsessed with success, with money, with proving something. The business has been struggling. Investments haven't paid off. But instead of facing it, I looked for an easy way out. Your money." Margaret watched her son's face, seeing in it echoes of the little boy who had always been too hard on himself, too determined to be the best. "When did it start?" she asked. "This idea about my competence?" Daniel winced at the directness of the question. It wasn't planned, not at first. We were discussing financial options, and someone at work mentioned how his uncle got control of his grandmother's estate through a competency hearing. It was just a passing comment, but it stuck with me, grew into this plan. The casual cruelty of it, a scheme born from a water cooler conversation, struck Margaret like a physical blow. "I see," she said quietly. "No, you don't," Daniel insisted, finally looking up to meet her eyes. "You don't see what I've become, who I've been for years now. This isn't new, Mom. It's just the worst version of what's always been there. This hunger for more, this fear of not being enough." In that moment, Margaret did see, not just the man before her, but the child he had been, the boy who had cried when he brought home an A instead of an A+, the teenager who had competed ruthlessly in every sport and academic challenge, the young man who had chosen his career not for love of the work, but for the prestige and salary it promised. "Your father and I," she said carefully, "we always pushed you to excel, perhaps too hard." Daniel shook his head. Don't take this on yourself. I'm an adult. I made choices, terrible, unforgivable choices." "Not unforgivable," Margaret said, the words surprising her as much as they seemed to surprise him. "Difficult to forgive, yes, but not impossible." "Why would you even consider forgiving me?" he asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "After what I tried to do." Margaret reached across the table and, for the first time since he was a small child having a nightmare, took her son's hand in both of hers. "Because holding on to anger would poison what's left of my life. Because you are still my son. And because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or trusting blindly again. It means choosing to move forward without being chained to the hurt." Daniel's composure finally broke. Tears slid down his face as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. Margaret moved around the table and did what she had done countless times throughout his childhood. She held him while he cried. Spring came, as it always does, with a gentle insistence that life continues. Margaret's garden burst into color, daffodils and tulips first, then the azaleas and rhododendrons adding their vibrant hues to the landscape. She spent hours tending to the new growth, finding in the simple act of nurturing plants a metaphor for the careful rebuilding of her fractured family. Daniel and Christine had reconciled, though their relationship remained fragile. The couple had entered counseling together, confronting not just the recent crisis, but years of accumulated tensions and unspoken resentments. They visited Margaret's home every other Sunday for dinner. Awkward affairs at first, gradually warming as weeks passed. Jacob, blessedly oblivious to the adult complexities swirling around him, continued to flourish. He spent every Saturday morning with Margaret now, helping in the garden, baking in the kitchen, or simply sprawled on her living room floor with books and toys while she knitted nearby. These hours became sacred to Margaret, time in which the future seemed to hold promise rather than threat. On a particularly beautiful May afternoon, as Margaret and Jacob planted sunflower seeds along the back fence, Daniel arrived unexpectedly. "Dad!" Jacob called, waving dirt-covered hands excitedly. "We're planting giants! Grandma says they'll grow taller than you." "Is that right?" Daniel replied, ruffling his son's hair. "Well, I can't wait to see that." He turned to Margaret. "Do you have a minute, Mum? There's something I'd like to talk to you about." Margaret nodded, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. "Jacob, why don't you fill the watering can and give our new seeds a drink while I talk to your father?" The boy dashed off happily, and Margaret led Daniel to the wrought-iron bench beneath the old maple tree. "Is everything all right?" she asked, noting the familiar tension in her son's shoulders. "Yes," he assured her quickly. "Everything's fine. Better than fine, actually." He took a deep breath. "I've made a decision about the business. I'm selling it." Margaret couldn't hide her surprise. "Your father's company, but you've worked so hard to grow it." "That's just it," Daniel replied, staring out across the garden. "I never wanted it in the first place. I took it over because I thought it was expected of me, because I didn't want to disappoint Dad. But I've been miserable, Mom, for years. What will you do instead?" Margaret asked, watching her son's face carefully. A smile, genuine and unguarded, spread across Daniel's features. I'm going back to school, to teach. Middle school science, if you can believe it. For the first time in months, Margaret felt something like joy bubble up within her. Daniel, that's wonderful. You always loved science, those chemistry sets, the telescope Dad bought you. I know. Somehow I forgot that along the way. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. The company's sale will clear our debts and leave enough to live comfortably, not lavishly, but honestly, the way we should have been living all along. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching Jacob carefully water the newly planted seeds, his small face a study in concentration. There's something else, Daniel said finally. The therapist suggested I make amends in concrete ways, not just with words. He reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope which he handed to Margaret. This is a copy of a letter I've sent to everyone I spoke to about your supposed condition. It contains a full retraction and apology. Margaret opened the envelope with trembling fingers and scanned the letter inside. The words were direct and unflinching, a complete admission of his deception and manipulation, with no attempt to minimize or justify his actions. You didn't have to do this, she said softly. Yes, I did, Daniel insisted. Your reputation, your relationships, they matter. I damaged them, and I needed to try to repair that damage, even if it meant humbling myself. Margaret refolded the letter carefully. Thank you. Another silence fell between them, more comfortable than the last. In the distance, Jacob had discovered a worm and was examining it with scientific curiosity. I'm not the son you deserved, Daniel said suddenly. I see that now. The way I've lived, the choices I've made, they're not what you and Dad taught me. Margaret turned to look at her son directly. In the slanting afternoon light, she could see both the boy he had been and the man he was becoming. A new version of himself, perhaps, one forged in the crucible of his worst actions and their consequences. We all fall short of who we should be, Daniel, she said gently. What matters is that we keep trying to be better. I am trying, he promised. Every day. I know, she replied, reaching over to squeeze his hand. I see it. Later, after Daniel and Jacob had gone home, Margaret sat on her porch as twilight descended. The world seemed softer in this light. Edges blurred, colors muted, harsh realities temporarily gentled by approaching darkness. She thought of all that had transpired over these past months, the betrayal, the confrontation, the slow and painful process of rebuilding trust. None of it had been easy. Some days, the hurt and anger still rose unexpectedly, catching her off guard with their intensity. Forgiveness, she was learning, was not a single act, but a practice, a choice that had to be made again and again. Yet as she watched the first stars appear in the deepening blue of the evening sky, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her life had not turned out as she had expected. The relationship with her son would never again have the uncomplicated trust of earlier years. But there was something valuable in this new arrangement, a hard-won honesty, a mutual recognition of human frailty, and perhaps most importantly, a second chance. Margaret reached for the journal she had been keeping since that first betrayal. Where once she had documented evidence of Daniel's deception, she now recorded moments of healing. Jacob's laughter in the garden, Christine's tentative hug at Easter dinner, Daniel's letter of amends. Small victories in a battle she hadn't chosen, but had somehow found the strength to fight. On the final page, she wrote, "Today, I planted sunflowers with my grandson. They will grow tall and strong, their faces always turning toward the light. Perhaps there is wisdom in this simple act of faith, to believe in growth even when the seeds lie hidden in darkness." She closed the journal and looked out at her garden one last time before going inside. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities for forgiveness and growth. For tonight, it was enough to know that she had survived the worst betrayal of her life and emerged not bitter, but wiser, not diminished, but somehow expanded by the experience. The lights of her home glowed warmly against the gathering night, a beacon of resilience in a world where even the deepest bonds could be tested, and where the human heart, miraculous in its capacity for both pain and healing, continued its steady, faithful beating. The backyard was transformed. White folding chairs arranged in neat rows faced a simple wooden arch decorated with summer wildflowers. Paper lanterns hung from tree branches, waiting for evening to fall when they would cast their gentle light over the celebration. Margaret sat in the front row, elegant in a pale blue dress, her silver hair arranged in a sophisticated updo that Jacob, now 11, had declared totally awesome, Grandma. Beside her sat Christine's parents, with whom she had formed an unexpected friendship during the past year. From inside the house came the sound of laughter, Christine and her bridesmaids making final preparations. Today, 3 years after nearly divorcing, Christine and Daniel were renewing their vows in the presence of family and friends. Not a grand ceremony in an expensive venue as their first wedding had been, but an intimate gathering in Margaret's garden, where so much healing had taken place. "Nervous?" Margaret asked, as Daniel emerged from the house, adjusting his tie. He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. At 42, her son looked younger than he had at 39, the burden of pretense and desperate ambition lifted from his shoulders. His first year of teaching had been challenging but deeply rewarding, his students responding to his genuine enthusiasm for science and discovery. "Not nervous," he replied, taking the seat next to her. "Just grateful." Before Margaret could respond, Jacob raced up, resplendent and slightly uncomfortable in his first suit. "Dad, Mum says it's almost time. I didn't lose the rings, I promise. I checked like 50 times. Daniel laughed, straightening his son's crooked tie. "I trust you completely, buddy. You'll be the best ring bearer in history." As Jacob dashed off to resume his important duties, Daniel turned back to Margaret. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, his expression growing serious. "The house. What about it?" Margaret asked, though she suspected what was coming. "Christine and I have been talking. With the baby coming in December, we could use more space, but we don't want to move away from you. We were wondering if you'd consider—" He hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "If you'd consider living with us. Not like before, not giving up your independence. But we could convert the garden level into a separate apartment for you. Your own entrance, your own kitchen. Close enough for daily visits with the grandkids, but with your privacy respected." Margaret studied her son's face, searching for any hint of the old Daniel, the calculating, manipulative man who had once plotted to take everything from her. She found no trace of him. Instead, she saw only genuine concern and hope. "I'd like that," she said simply. "Very much." Relief and joy spread across Daniel's features. "Really, you're sure?" "I'm sure," Margaret confirmed. "It's time for a new chapter." As guests began to arrive, filling the garden with cheerful conversation, Margaret excused herself to help Christine with a last-minute detail. On her way to the house, she paused beside the towering sunflowers that lined the back fence, the descendants of those first seeds she and Jacob had planted 3 years ago. Year after year, they had reseeded themselves, returning with stubborn persistence, their golden faces lifted toward the sun. Nature's reminder that even after the harshest winter, life continues. That from tiny seeds planted in darkness, something magnificent can grow. Margaret touched one massive bloom gently, remembering all the seasons that had brought her to this moment. The bitter cold of betrayal, the tentative warmth of reconciliation, and now the full summer of restoration. Not perfection, but something perhaps more valuable. A family tested, broken, and ultimately reformed into something stronger at the damaged places. As the music began and the ceremony commenced, Margaret took her place beside Jacob, who clutched the ring pillow with solemn importance. Together they watched as Christine walked toward Daniel, radiant in a simple white dress, her hand resting protectively over the slight swell of their second child. When the couple exchanged their vows, promises made with a depth and awareness that only comes from nearly losing everything, tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks. Not tears of sadness or even nostalgia, but of profound gratitude for second chances, for the resilience of love, and for the wisdom that comes only through suffering and forgiveness. Later, as twilight descended and the paper lanterns glowed like earthbound stars, Margaret found herself surrounded by family and friends, all raising glasses in celebration. Daniel stood, his arm around Christine, to offer a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his gaze finding Margaret's across the gathering. "And to my mother, who taught me the true meaning of grace when I least deserved it." The glasses clinked, the moment perfect in its simplicity and truth. "And before we continue our celebration," Daniel added, "I'd like to remind everyone to subscribe to this wonderful channel for more stories that touch the heart and remind us of what truly matters in life. Your support means everything to creators who work to bring these meaningful narratives to you. Don't forget to leave a like and comment on what this story meant to you." As the evening deepened into night, Margaret stood at the edge of her garden, watching the celebration continue. Tomorrow would bring its own joys and challenges. The journey of healing was never truly complete, but tonight, beneath a canopy of stars and surrounded by the love she had nearly lost, Margaret Lawson knew with absolute certainty that trust, once broken, could indeed be rebuilt. Different perhaps, but in some ways stronger than before. And in that knowledge, there was peace.